Hi friends, welcome back to Arc Tutorials. We are continuing with our Expert Angular Interview Series, Part 2. If you haven't checked the previous part, please do so. This will guarantee you that you can crack any Angular interview that you're attending. It covers questions from basic to advanced. This is a collection of over 200 interview question and answers, and you are bound to clear any Angular interview that you're attending. There is a lot of hard work that I'm putting in compiling these questions for you. So please support me by subscribing my channel and liking my videos. If you have any doubts, just ask me and I'm happy to help you for free. Let's get started with Angular Top Interview Question and Answers Expert Series Part 2. So the first question is, what is data binding? Data binding is a core concept in Angular and allows us to define communication between a component and the DOM. So more often we will need to communicate from template to component and component to the view. So there are four forms of data binding that can be used, which are in three main categories. The first is from component to DOM, from DOM to component, and there is two-way data binding also. We will see them in detail now in the next sections, but for now, understand what is data binding and what are the different forms. So data binding is a concept to connect component to DOM and DOM to component. There are three main categories: from component to DOM connection, from DOM to component, and then two-way data binding. Let's see them in detail. So what is component to DOM binding? So component to DOM binding is also called as interpolation. So remember, they can also ask you what is interpolation. So interpolation is nothing but whenever we add the value in double curly braces, it means the data is flowing from component to the DOM. So if you see here example user.name and user.address, in your component you would have written some value for user.name and user.address. That is what will be used to display it in the template. Similarly, we have something called property binding. So in the previous interpolation, it would just put the value, but not the properties. So we can also put properties by something like input type equal to email. And here I'm setting a property which is value equal to user.email. So in your component, when you have a value of user.email, that will get mapped to value attribute. So this is called component to DOM binding. Or in other words, you can be asked what is interpolation and what is property binding. So go through this really well. Ask me if you have any doubts. I'll give you more examples in the comments. What is from the DOM to component data binding? So this is basically a event binding. So in the previous question, we saw about interpolation and property binding. This is event binding, where we are binding an event to the component. So in the example here, we are putting button and we are attaching a click event to it. Click equal to logout. So there is a logout function defined in our component. We are calling it from the template. This is called event binding. Now, this is an important question that is always asked, which is what is two-way data binding? So two-way data binding allows us to have data flow from both ways. This is achieved by using the square brackets. Inside that we'll put a function bracket, which is ng model. So when you put ng model equal to user.email, the value will be sent from component to DOM and from DOM to a component, right? So if you have when you want to send data both ways, it is called two-way data binding, from component to DOM, from DOM to component. Now, what is metadata? So metadata is used to decorate a class so that it can configure the expected behavior of the class. Now, there are four different types of decorators or metadata that you can use. First is class decorator, property decorator, method decorator, and finally parameter decorator. So we will see all of them in detail in the next questions. But for now, understand that metadata is used to decorate a class, and then it is represented by decorators. So what is a class decorator? So here you can see that we are using something called @component, @ng module. These are all class decorators because it's a class which takes parameters. So this is a good example of class decorator. So whenever you are asked, can you give some example of class decorators? You can always talk about @component decorator and @ng module decorator. Now similarly, they'll ask you what is a property decorator? So property decorator is whenever inside the class you will use properties like @input, @output. Those become part of property decorators inside the class. So @component is the main class, and here you see it's a class decorator, whereas @input is a property decorator. Now, what is a method decorator? So methods are used inside the classes. So for example, if you use something like @host listener here, so this is a method decorator or a function decorator because inside the class you're calling this decorator and attaching an event to it. So basically it's a function which you're calling inside the class. So this is called as method decorator. And finally, what is a parameter decorator? So parameters are used inside the class constructors. For example, @inject. So those are parameter decorators which you are passing as parameters. You can see here inside the constructor, we are passing @inject my service. So it is a constructor we are passing. It's a parameter we are passing inside the class constructors. So these are the four different types of decorators. Make sure you go back and revise all the four decorators, understand them really well. Again, if you have any doubts, need more clarification, let me know in the comment section. I'll give you more examples. Now, what is Angular CLI? Now, this is to see your understanding whether have you really worked or not. So Angular CLI is a command line interface to scaffold and build Angular apps using Node.js style. You need to install using the below npm command. Or the question can also be, how do you install Angular CLI? We can say npm install @angular/CLI. Now, can you list some of the commands that are used in Angular CLI? So they are interested in knowing what commands have you used and are you aware of. So you can start by saying ng-new, which is to create a new project. You can use ngGenerate is a very important command. You can generate class, you can generate component, you can generate directive, you can generate enum, module, pipe, service just by passing commands like ngGenerate class, ngGenerate component, component name. So go through these commands. This is how ngGenerate is very important to generate components or directives, services in your application. To run the project, we will run using ngserve. And to test, we can use ngTest. If you want to run end-to-end test, you'll write ngE2E. So these are the various different commands that Angular CLI provides. Make sure you go through them and remember to speak all of them when you are asked in the interview. So what is the difference between constructor and ngOnInit? If you are an experienced developer, they are bound to ask you this question. Tell me the difference between constructor and ngOnInit. So TypeScript classes have a default method called constructor, which is nothing but object-oriented constructor class method. Now ngOnInit is very specific to Angular. So whenever your class gets an object is created, Angular will bind all the through the life cycle stages, which we have covered in part 1. So go through, make sure you have seen the part 1 interview series also. So even though constructor is getting called first, it is always preferred to move all your Angular bindings to ngOnInit because this is very specific to Angular and it is used for all Angular bindings, initializing, content view init, after content init, etc. So here you can see a simple example where in this is a class. It has both methods, constructor and ngOnInit. So constructor is always called the first time, and once ngOnInit is called after the constructor and after all the ngOnInit changes are done. Now, what is a service? So this is, if you work with any Angular application, you will have to make use of integration with backend services. So you need to have some HTTP services, you need some services which are reusable code. So this is a very, very important functionality. So what is a service? A service is used when a common functionality needs to be provided for various modules. Services allow for greater separation of concerns for your application. It adds for better modularity by allowing you to extract common functionality of components. What is dependency injection in Angular? So dependency injection is an important application design pattern in which a class asks for dependencies from external sources rather than creating them itself. Which means, in simple words, whenever we have any services or objects that you need to pass it to some other thing, we have to inject them. We have to resolve them, resolve the dependencies because we are just importing them. So think of it. So whenever you have your services depend on other services, you need to inject them into the class first. What is the purpose of async pipe? Now, we'll cover about pipes in detail in coming sections, but for now, understand what is async pipe. Async pipe subscribes to an observable or promise and returns the latest value it has emitted. Whenever a new value is emitted, the pipe marks the component to be checked for changes. So we'll cover all of this in detail, friends. So don't worry if you don't understand this concept now. We have a lot more explanations coming in just in some time. What is the option to choose between inline and external template file? So if you remember in part 1, we have seen the difference between different types of templates that you can use. So inline is where you can include the template right inside your component decorator. That way, because if you have less HTML or less template which you want to show, you can use that. But normally we use whenever there is a bigger view or large code for view, we'll use it in external template file. By default, the Angular CLI generates components with a template file. All right, so that brings us to the end of part 2. I hope you are following and enjoying this series. If you are preparing for an Angular interview, this series will definitely help you 100% crack the interview. Just follow all the part series thoroughly. Ask me doubts if you have any in the comment section. I will be happy to help you for free. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel to keep supporting me and encouraging me. Go through all the parts, go through all the questions. If you don't understand something, just ask me. I'm here to help you. Thank you so much for joining in this part. We'll see you in the next part, which is part 3 of Expert Angular Interview Series. Thank you so much for joining. See you in the next part.